Greetings, YouTube. Today, we're taking a look at Playing at the World, a history of simulating wars, people, and fantastic adventures from chess to role-playing games by John Peterson. Now, I actually have some notes on this one. I don't usually do that, but I do. So, here we go. My friend Jan asked me to read this book. And at the time he asked me to, I could not afford to pick up a copy because it's like $35 a pop. So I said I'd have to wait on that. Jan would not be deterred by something like that. So a copy of it showed up in my mailbox, or on my porch, I should say, because it's too big to fit in my mailbox. And since he really wanted me to read it, and he got me a copy, I found, okay, I am obligated to read this book. It's a big book. It's got the feeling of a textbook. It is written in many ways like a technical manual. Each passage heading, for example, it's like chapter 3.1.23 or 3.1.3. Reiswitz's Father and Sons, 1811 to 1824. It's really written like a technical manual in many ways. It comes across in flavor for much of the book as though it was a dissertation. Now, I've been reading since I was 5, so 51 years. I've read every single day of my life something. Like my mom tells me when I was a kid, when I ran out of books in the house, I read the dictionary. You'd think I'd be able to spell better. But I am an inveterate reader. And at work, I read nothing but nonfiction. And I can normally go through 10 to 15 pages of a nonfiction book when I'm on break. And I only read for about 20 minutes or a little bit, sometimes half an hour a day. But this book is very dense. And it was a task to get through it. And I would be probably reading only 4 or 5 pages at a time. And I'm going to explain why in a minute. So this book, which is 632 pages, and that's not counting the bibliography, which is 25 pages, or the index, which is 30 pages, took me 6 months to read. 6 months. I have spent more time with this book than with any other book in my entire life. Period. And I have books that I have read multiple times that I have still not spent as much time with this book here. All right. So that lays out a few things you need to know before we get any further. So let's talk about the book itself. We're going to start with the back cover. Praise for playing at the world. I'm not going to read all of this. We have something from Wired. Now, Wired puts itself forward as kind of a geeky, nerdy kind of place. So it kind of makes sense that Wired might be involved because they are kind of in touch with the geeks and the nerds of the world. So I'm not going to say that they're industry insiders, but I'm going to say that they are tangent, yeah, whatever, to the nerdy, geeky community of the world. Okay? Then we have The Village. Then we have Jeff Grubb, rather. He's an industry insider. Then we have The Village Voice. This one threw me for a loop because I have never really thought of The Village Voice as the kind of magazine that would have any interest in this, even though it's being touted as history/popular culture. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe someone at Village Voice owed Peterson a favor. Then we had Tim Kask, early TSR employee and first editor of the Dragon magazine, Industry Insider. We had Games Magazine, Industry Insiders. Then we had Lawrence Schick, editor, Days and Demigods, author of Heroic Worlds, Industry Insider. And Peter Atkinson, founder and former CEO of Wizards of the Coast, Industry Insider. So with the exception of The Village Voice, everyone involved in this has something to do with the world of gaming, or at least geeks and nerds. Remember that. Good. Like I said, it's heavy, it's big, it's kind of a weird size and scale. It really feels like a textbook. I know I've been lugging it around for 6 months. It feels like a textbook. And from the front, I kind of entered this with the idea I'd be starting with chess and moving through time. But the book starts with board games in the 1950s and 60s. Okay? Because those were the games that Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson were playing that interested them in gaming and got them in contact with each other, which then led to their collaboration. So the fact that the book starts there kind of makes sense, and it's right out of the bat. It gives me, the reader, the impression, okay, we're getting into the Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson stuff pretty soon. It's a bit of a tease. The books, Peterson talks a lot about the board games of the era. He talks a little about wargaming, miniatures and moving figures around, actual figures around a board, either a flat map, or sometimes they would even have sand tables where they would use damp sand to build terrain for their battles. And the pieces on the board, sometimes they were actual soldiers or cannons and things. They usually represented units. So one figure would represent 10 soldiers or 100 soldiers, depending on what scale you were using. And they were simulating, for the most part, real world things, either reenacting real battles or using the equipment and the soldiers of a specific era to fight fictional battles, but in that era. Okay? That's what they were doing for the most part. And the big dog on campus was Avalon Hill. I have some Avalon Hill games. I even own Wilderness Survival, which is a game which affected wargaming and early iterations of the earliest iteration of D&D and Chainmail and D&D. So I picked mine up at a yard sale. But it was around, and it had an impact on the game that we know as Dungeons & Dragons. So starting out with that made perfect sense. Avalon Hill was big. And if you were to ask me, when you say board games, Avalon Hill is going to be the first name that comes to my head. I don't know what kind of condition the company's in now. I really don't. I have no idea if they're even still extant. But I know that in my head, I think board games, I think Avalon Hill. So Peterson starting with Avalon Hill made perfect sense. He also goes very deep into diplomacy, which is a game I never really thought of as having a huge community or built around it, but they did. But diplomacy, both face-to-face games and then mail-order games, play-by-mail games were huge. And it kind of made sense with diplomacy because it was all interaction. And when you needed to roll a die in any kind of play-by-mail games, a lot of the time they would use like stock markets. They would say, okay, this stock on that day is going to generate the random numbers we need. So that would be an impartial way of generating numbers that no one could declare that, and say, oh, you were cheating. You weren't cheating. Everybody's referring to the same stock market. So you're good. And there were a lot of variations on diplomacy. And some of the people were playing diplomacy-like games, and one of them started a game set in Hyperion, Conan's world. But it wasn't a fantasy game in the sense of, magic and dragons and stuff. He picked it because Hyperion allowed him to have different technological levels and cultures in conflict with each other in a way that didn't happen in the real world. So this guy wanted, I can't remember his name, I apologize. This guy wanted to have battles between units that would have never made sense. They never would have come in contact in the real world, but he still wanted to do it. So that allowed him to do it. Now, throughout this text that I'm reading, there is just so much data being thrown at the reader. Literally every few sentences there is data, data, data. There are specific names being thrown at you, dates being thrown at you. Peterson talks extensively, and I mean unbelievably extensively, about the fanzines and the magazines that supported the board games and the diplomacy and the diplomacy-like games of that era. That's how Gygax and Arneson met each other, was through those magazines, through like a Opponents Wanted kind of ad. Geeks trying to get in contact with each other for actually face-to-face games or for play-by-mail games. Because of that style of writing, data, 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 every few lines, I was only reading 4 to 5 pages a day. Because there was so much coming at me, it was hard to follow the story while also absorbing the data. And almost every page in this book has footnotes. And I'm not being facetious here. I would say and I'm not joking, 98 to 99% of the pages in this book have footnotes. Now, thank you, Mr. Peterson, for putting the footnotes on the page. They're in the back of the book. I would have never read them, and some of the footnotes were very useful. But some of the footnotes were huge. Now, remember, a footnote is a smaller font than the rest of the text. So a large footnote would be almost a full page in some cases. And there's actually a couple footnotes in here that are a third to a half of a page long. That's a big footnote. Okay? He goes really into detail in these magazines and these fanzines. He tells you when they were founded, the editor that founded them, when the editors changed, who was contributing articles. Were they from Europe, or rather mostly England? Were they from America? Did they know about each other? Was there cross-fertilization for ideas, or were they working in these communities working in isolation? Because we're talking about English-speaking, so mostly it's the UK and the US. So much detail on those magazines and fanzines. It is just astounding what he did. So I found myself kind of overwhelmed with that information. Again, 4 to 5 pages a day because there's so much data hitting me. It's like it's a real slog for me to read this. But I promised Jan I would, so I kept going. Eventually, at the end of chapter 2, we finally get to Gygax, and well, he gets into fantasy, and then we get to Gygax. When I say he gets into fantasy, he talks extensively about the fantasy writing of the era, from the pulp magazines of the 30s, which were still being read by the gamers of the 50s and 60s, and all the fantasy novels of that era. But of course, the big dog in that was Tolkien. And that inspired a huge amount of variations on diplomacy, reenacting Tolkien's battles, and in some cases, using Tolkien's characters and those armies to do fictional battles to see, does Sauron win this time, that kind of thing. In the kind of simulation that we think of nothing of now, because we all have computer games to do this if we want to play that kind of thing. All right? So it's finally getting to that point in the world where people are incorporating fantasy, real fantasy, dwarves and hobbits and elves and magic and dragons. And it's out of this environment that Gygax writes Chainmail. And Chainmail is a one-to-one game. Yeah, it's still a war game, but it's one-to-one war game. Up until now, there was immersive people doing immersive kind of gaming, but usually it was after action reports or diplomacy like propaganda and news articles written from the perspective of a leader or something. So there was immersive things going on. But it wasn't like what Gygax was suggesting with this one-on-one kind of, you're playing an individual character. Most of the time, the only individual be on a battlefield would be the general. Everybody else was a figure representing a unit. So Gygax was suggesting you're going to play a specific individual. You're going to be immersive in the sense that you can't help being attached to that single character, even though he didn't necessarily use those terms. He's presenting war game rules that let you play a one-on-one encounter with each other. Okay? Out of Chainmail grows Blackmoor, which is Dave Arneson's baby. And Blackmoor is the Blackmoor Castle and the dungeon underneath it. And he's putting his friends through that meat grinder of a dungeon using Chainmail and, of course, whatever house rules. Everybody had house rules. Who doesn't have house rules? So as I get to the end of chapter 2, Peterson goes into some wonderful detail about Chainmail. Specific classes, the elements of the game, combat resolution, everything involving in it. He talks about Wilderness Survival by Avalon Hill because that was often used as a reference for outdoor encounters, that kind of thing, as opposed to being inside of a dungeon. Because most of the gaming they were doing like this, the fantasy stuff, were dungeon delves. They weren't doing any politicking at villages and things like that. It was dungeon delving. It was a war game environment. You had a win situation, you had a goal, and you had to have a winner. Usually it might be like who got the most gold, or who got a specific item, captured a flag kind of thing. So at the end of chapter 2, I'm like, cool, We finally done. He's broken down chainmail. I am ready to launch into like a deep discussion about Blackmore, which then leads into D&D. And chapter 3 starts, and Peterson says that for us to have an understanding, the reader having an understanding, there needs to be a brief aside concerning war games, which is when I said out loud, "No, there doesn't," which probably shocked my coworkers in the room with me at the time, because he had talked to more about wargaming in the board game section, enough for me to understand the import of war games to the board games, and then all of it to Gygax and Arneson. I had a clear picture in my head. But Peterson wanted me, the reader, to know more. And his little brief aside, 100 pages. 100 pages with every few lines, data, 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 data. Numbers, dates, magazines, specific pages, articles, editors. There was a point in this book where he was listing the specific people playing a game, or the specific people that were talking about a game in a specific issue of a magazine. Too much detail. I'm going to give you an example of what I mean. There's a footnote in here about a gentleman in the 18th century. Yeah, we start with chess, then we dive into the 18th century of board games. So we're going from the 1950s to the 18th century. Remember, 100 pages of this. He talks about a man named Helvig, which was very important to the development of war games as became popularized, and then those, of course, led to board games, commercialized board games. And he talks about the fact that Helvig can be spelled with 1 or 2 L's. Now, I actually knew this, not because of this dude, but because I've encountered the name before in my reading, and sometimes I've seen it with 1, and sometimes I've seen it with 2, and it never threw me for a loop. I didn't even really think about it. I did note it, but I kept reading. So to tell the reader that Helvig is sometimes spelled with 1 L or 2 L's, would it be a little parentheses thing, or maybe a 2-line footnote? Peterson puts a footnote in about this man's name that fills a third of the page. Now remember, the font on a footnote is smaller than the font for the body of the text. So this thing would be more than a half a page of text about how to spell Helvig's name. That's more information about Helvig's name than I needed. That's more information about how to spell Helvig's name than anyone needed. That's more information about how to spell Helvig's name than Helvig needed. I'm like, wow. So I keep forging ahead. Again, Jan wants me to read this. I'm not going to give up. And at this point, I've gotten so stubborn, I will finish this book. So we get to about page 280, and we're still talking about war games. And at the end of one of these little passages, little numbered sections I showed you, Peterson talks about a war game being conducted, or that had been conducted by the Coast Guard. I believe it may have been at the turn of the century, or maybe the early 20th century. And this war game was about how to defend the coast. Made perfect sense. One team of players is defending the coast, and one team of players is attacking the coast. The perfect kind of war game for a Coast Guard to play, to get in their heads how they would respond to an actual scenario. At the end of that little discussion, the last things he says in that passage, before we jump to the next passage, the next section of the book, Peterson says that, but it is unlikely that this war game had any impact on Gygax or the development of Dungeons & Dragons. Which is where, again, out loud, I said, then why are you telling me? And then it hit me. Peterson's telling me this because he has to. And I have nothing but the most utter empathy for that. I have a YouTube channel. I pontificate on a daily basis and have been doing it for more than 11 bloody years. I understand the need to tell people something. My poor suffering wife listens to me blather on constantly. I have to fight the urge to tell her things that I know that she doesn't want to hear just because I feel that need to tell somebody, and she is the closest audience I've got. So I understand why Peterson did that. He had to tell me. He knew it. He had to tell me. But it wasn't pertinent to this story. It had no bearing on it. It didn't really inform me about anything that I needed to know about war games, board games, Gygax, Arneson, or the history of D&D. And that's what the whole book has been like up till now. I keep going. And I'm trying to figure out what it is about this book that's really bugging me. Besides the fact that, again, data every few sentences. Huge footnotes, incredible detail. And around page 320, it hits me. The narrative voice. Every author has a narrative voice. And some authors, it's really, really clear. Like I read Adam Savage's book. I could hear Adam Savage talking in my head when I was reading it. James Burke, James Campbell, Attenborough, I can hear their voices in my head when I read their text. But even the authors I've never heard them speak, they still have a narrative voice. There's a rhythm, a cadence to their writing. And the more you read an author, the better you get at understanding how they write. You can read them faster, at least I can. And a good author can use that against you intentionally. Stephen Bruce did that once. An absolute genius moment in a book where he just went and hit you by changing that narrative beat. It was beautiful. I can't hear Peterson's narrative voice because of all the data. So now I'm thinking, okay, I've defined what it is that's bugging me. Why did Peterson do this? And then I figured it out. Peterson was defending his book while the reader is reading his book. The dissertation defense of his book is baked into the book itself. Peterson hasn't been writing the book to me. Peterson has been writing the book to his critics. It is though Peterson is imagining there's this gray-bearded grognard from the 1970s over my shoulder, reading the book with me, who is going to point out every single thing Peterson got wrong. And so Peterson has to make sure he gets nothing wrong. And the book up until now has been talking to that guy over my shoulder who isn't there. So now I know why it's bugging me, but it doesn't change the fact that I'm still slogging through it. And to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, some of you have probably listened to commentary tracks on movies. I love them. I'll go out of my way to find them. I'll pay extra money for them. I will even buy movies that I might not never watch otherwise just because I want to listen to that commentary track at some date in the future to get the inside scoop. But what I'm never going to do, or very rarely going to do, is watch a movie for the first time with a commentary track on. I want to watch the movie, understand the story, and then listen to the commentary track at a later date. Peterson, up to this point in the book, has turned that commentary track on, and I can't turn it off. I'm trying to listen to the story he's telling me about the history of D&D, but the commentary track keeps interrupting what he's telling me. And that's why it's been so hard to read. So I figured all this out around page 320. I keep slogging ahead. Again, John's my friend. I'm going to finish this book. Get to around page somewhere between 400 and 420. And all of a sudden, a miracle happens. The defensive dialogue disappears. The footnotes are still there, but the defensive dialogue in the body of the text stops. And suddenly, I can hear Peterson's narrative voice. And I like it. He's a good storyteller. I'm enjoying Peterson tell me the story of the history of Dungeons & Dragons. It was like the rays of the sun shining through the clouds. And I'm happy. And I'm also sad. Because this is what I wanted from page 1. And I had to go through 400 pages of a book until I got it. In my mind, that's a big ask. So now that I'm getting into the story, it's a lot of fun to read. The early version of D&D, which grew out of the collaboration between Gygax and Arneson out of Blackmore. Gygax's control freakiness nature, the litigious situation between he and Arneson. I still don't think Arneson should have got a piece of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but I also think that Gygax treated him pretty badly. I now understand that I always known that Gygax was a bit of a jerk to a lot of people, but I thought that was something that happened when he was older, kind of a version of engineer's disease, or the kind of thing that happened to Frank Miller, who was a genius writer, comic writer in his younger years, but then bought his own hype and now became insufferable. And I know that in his later years, Gygax, in a lot of ways, was his own PR man and was more than willing to massage reality to make himself sound good. But Peterson helped me understand that he's been like that pretty much since his teen years. So that wasn't a change of character. He just got more of it as it went on. So I never had a really positive view of Gygax, and I still don't. And I have a lot of sympathy for Arneson, even though I don't think he's necessarily gotten a piece of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons version of the game. But it talks about how people were adapting D&D. They were taking characters to like 50, 60, 100 levels. Gygax didn't like it. He thought that was outlandish, so he was always trying to rein people in. He got very litigious if anyone tried to use the elements of his game or the name of his game, and people got cease and desist orders all the time. I knew about that. He did not want to cross Gygax and his lawyers. They would come after you in a heartbeat. Those letters would just go out of the office if you tried to step on his intellectual property. And that was very interesting. And that how he presented the world with basic D&D, the box set, because that was limited 1 to 3 levels, and then he had introduced Advanced. And again, that was also a limited scope. It wasn't designed for characters that were super, super high level, even though we played characters well beyond 20th level, because I have a portrait on the wall right now of a character that was 26, I think, when I finally retired him. That kind of power gaming got boring after a while for me. But I was enjoying the story that he told me. And the rest of the book was fun. It really was. The epilogue was a little bit of a letdown for me, because he's talking about how computer games grew out of D&D and like Adventure and Zork, text-based computer games, which you had to like have mainframes to run on, but eventually they were able to play on home computers, which at the time were like $500 to $1,000 for a very, very simple computer. Pets and Trash 80s, things like that, were playing early computer games, and a lot of them were inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. In that particular section, the epilogue, it seemed to lack a little bit of the energy that the book had between 400 and around 600. So maybe he was just tired at that point. I don't know. But he still did give you a lot of information about the early adventure games. You have been eaten by a grue. But it was still useful to know. But it didn't have quite the same enjoyment for me as the section of the book in the last 200 pages. And again, then we have a bibliography and an extensive index. So I think that inside this 632-page book, there is a great 300-page book about Dungeons & Dragons. It just is going to need a genius editor and a chainsaw to find. And then you should have a 300-page addendum at the end. So Peterson can defend his book in that addendum after we, the reader, have gotten a chance to enjoy the story of the history of chess and board games and D&D. And I would have preferred the book if that had been the structure, the timeline. Start with chess, war games, board games, D&D, as opposed to board games, chainmail, war games, a whole bunch of information about like the etymology of the words Dungeons and Dragons and the words about some of the current of the most popular monsters like goblins and things, and discussions about what the nature of role playing is. He gets very deep into some of these things. Again, a lot of detail in here. A lot of it's useful. A lot of it I found very difficult to get through. It just needs to be restructured in my book, because the way this is written right now, it's a tough read for me. It really was. And I can't imagine it's not going to be a tough read for anybody. But now I understand why those industry insiders liked it so much. You see, all of them may have been there, but they weren't at every moment. So they wanted the commentary track on. They wanted the inside scoop to all the stuff they'd missed out on because they couldn't have been everywhere, because some were in Boston and some were in Lake Geneva and some were in San Francisco. They were going to cons and bumping into each other kind of thing, but they didn't have the overlap. The internet wasn't here, so they didn't get to see all slices of that pie. And Peterson has all put it together, so now they can. They can see the whole thing. And that's why they love this book. Which gets me, there's another question I got is, who is this book written for? It says history and popular culture. This is a textbook kind of density, a dissertation kind of density. No casual reader is going to want to read this. Not even gamers are going to want to read this. I started in 78, and I've been around for a while, and lots of folks have been. But a lot of us would have a hard time reading this. It would just be too much information. If it wasn't for the fact that I promised Jan I would read it, and then it became a point of contention, I wouldn't have finished this book. It just, with no narrative voice and so much data hit me like it was too much. It was just too difficult to get through. So is Peterson writing this for the 1,000 people that were involved in D&D back in the 70s and early 80s? That seems like a really small target audience. I don't think this falls under the category of popular culture. This is a really narrow slice. And I would be interested to know how many books of this have sold. How many people have read this? Because it really reads like something that was aimed at academics and has a really small audience. And lastly, even though there's lots of role-playing games, thousands of them now, and there's lots of us, from casuals to dedicated to grognards to people who've picked it up yesterday, we're still a really small drop in the ocean of entertainment. So there's the chance that John Peterson might see this video someday. And I want him to know that I didn't say anything in this in a state of animosity. And that I sincerely and genuinely am in awe of the amount of work he did for this book. When I say dissertation, that was not just to tell you the style of writing. It's because I think this is a genuine scholarly text. Literally worthy of a PhD. The amount of research that went into this is mind-numbing. I cannot believe that anybody did that much work and put it in here. There's a reason the bibliography is 25 pages long. So I am greatly impressed and have nothing but respect for you, Mr. Peterson, if you see this. Thank you. You have done something that I think is a great service to the community. I'm just not sure how many of us are going to read it. I apologize for something. Sorry about that. And I know I'm not editing that out. And lastly, to Jan. Only for you, Jan. Only for you, brother. I love you. Thanks for listening. I know it was a long video.